Before the Emperor strode across the stars and wrapped mankind in the choking grip of light and order, there was a time when humanity wandered blind through the night of its own making. It was not weakness that led them into the shadows. It was wisdom born of terror. They were the drowners of light, civilizations that smothered their worlds in darkness not out of savagery, but to survive the shrieking eyes of the warp. In those forgotten epics, light was not salvation. It was invitation, a flare into the endless abyss, beckoning horrors with open arms. The Imperium remembers only what it chooses. It tells us the night is to be feared, that light is the Emperor's gaze, ever vigilant, ever holy. But there are whispers, ancient and fading, of those who knew better, who saw what happens when the Imperium sees you back. They covered their cities in veils, bled their stars into black, and walked in silence through invisible streets. And in that chosen blindness, they lived. The age of strife was not merely a period of collapse. It was a cataclysmic reordering of what it meant to be human in the galaxy. Warp storms tore across the stars with such ferocity that travel, communication, and trust in reality itself became impossible. Entire systems vanished into the screaming void, their last messages garbled by static and psychic howls. The Astronomicon had not yet been kindled. The Emperor was but a dream, if even that. And so, amid the ruins of the once glorious age of technology, human civilizations were left adrift, blind and terrified. But survival often demands blasphemy. When the warp's reach became too close, too hungry, many worlds began to learn an unspoken truth. The warp feeds on attention, on signals, on energy, on minds that burn too brightly. Cities with thriving psychic networks, radiant starports, or sprawling light grids were among the first to vanish into demonic storms. Astropaths became liabilities, their voices drawing predatory things through the veil. The bright, the loud, the visible, they all perished. And so, slowly, a terrible wisdom began to spread. It was not taught through scripture or formal knowledge. It emerged like a bruise across the void, a pattern observed through loss. Worlds that dimmed their presence, cut off transmissions, reduced surface energy output, and fell into darkness, survived longer. Not always, but longer. Artificial night was born not from invention, but from desperate imitation. Rumors of a darkened colony surviving where dozens of others had burned were enough to provoke seismic changes in behavior. Some planetary leaders enacted blackout mandates, cloaking entire continents beneath atmospheres thick with engineered pollutants or magnetospheric distortions. Others went further, dismantling orbital relays, banning artificial lighting, and implementing complete visual silence from orbit. These places became nearly invisible to warp-spawned perception, or so they believed. What began as survival tactics evolved into dogma, enforced with the iron will of planetary governors turned night priests. Light, once a symbol of triumph, became taboo, heretical in the truest sense. The adoption of darkness was not uniform, however. On many worlds, conflicting ideologies clashed violently. Some clung to the belief that light meant hope, that darkness only fed the warp's hunger for fear. Others believed light was what it hunted. These civil disputes were not just philosophical, they were wars. Skirmishes over whether to maintain citywide lumens or collapse into subterranean enclaves. Dozens of civilizations extinguished themselves in flame and fury, unable to agree on whether to stand in light or drown in darkness. There were victories, strange and hidden. Some worlds, having fully embraced artificial night, began to vanish from even the charts of rogue traders and wayfarers. Not because they died, but because they stopped being found. They left no signals, no lights, no energy spikes to detect. These ghost worlds became legends, dark places said to be free from chaos incursions, untainted by the demonic. But there was a cost. Communication was severed. Trade collapsed. Cultural contact ended. Entire planets regressed into technomystic states, worshipping the very blackout fields that kept them alive. Artificial night was not always technological. On primitive or devolved worlds, it took on other forms. Ritual blackout, where families smeared their homes in soot and walked blindfolded during warp flare seasons. Forest enclaves built under canopies of blackened leaves, cultivated and gene-spliced to absorb and nullify photons. The cultural adaptations were as diverse as they were desperate. Light became not merely functional, it became moral. To be seen was to be cursed. The warp responded. Sometimes even darkness was not enough. On certain cursed nights, veils of null light failed. Demons tore through anyway, drawn perhaps not by photons but by memory, dreams, or ancient wounds. But in a cruel calculus, the drowners survived more than they perished. The brightest lights were always the first to die. Across the shattered remnants of mankind, the lesson took root. Light is not safety. Light is noise. Light is bait. And so, the drowners learned to live in silence and shade. 1,000 broken civilizations scattered across void-blackened systems, hidden behind layers of engineered dusk. They did not thrive. They endured. And in the endless horror of the age of strife, endurance was the closest thing to victory. The mind craves light. In its absence, it begins to dream of fire, of burning suns, safe hearths, and luminous sanctuaries. But the drowners of light had to unlearn this instinct, to tear out the psychic need for illumination. What emerged in its place was something colder, deeper, and altogether more alien than the human psyche had ever known. When light became a vector for death, darkness became theology. Survival bred a philosophy that twisted the core of human cognition. Entire cultures reshaped their identities, not just around hiding from the warp, but in venerating the night itself. It wasn't enough to be unseen. They had to believe in the virtue of obscurity. Faith systems emerged around the act of unbeing. The less you were, visually, mentally, spiritually, the safer you became. Children were taught to see blindness as blessing. Eyes were seen as betrayals, gifts of perception that exposed the soul to demonic attention. In these societies, religious orders took the role of what we might call cognitive engineers. They didn't merely preach silence, they instilled it as cultural reflex. To speak aloud during warp flare seasons was punishable by exile, sometimes death. Even thoughts were trained into muteness, with meditative disciplines designed to suppress dream emissions. Worship became a silent act, performed in pitch-black temples with no icons, no candles, only a whispering understanding between devotees. Faith was not something declared. It was something buried. Entire languages adapted. Words for bright, glow, and shine fell into disuse, replaced with complex metaphors for concealment, for cooling, for quiet. In some cases, sign languages evolved to replace speech entirely, used even in the dark by feel and memory. Stories were passed down not in books or images, but in mnemonic codes, tapped patterns, and rhythmic breathing rituals that could not be intercepted by warp entities. The psychological toll was immense. Generations raised in perpetual twilight often displayed flat affect, hypervigilance, and an instinctual aversion to open spaces. To outsiders, they appeared stunted or feral, but this was misinterpretation. They had not regressed. They had adapted. Their minds were not broken but sharpened for a reality where attention was death and invisibility, salvation. Paranoia became tradition, and tradition law. Not all adaptations were voluntary. On worlds where warp storms lasted for centuries, the pressure of the Imperium physically altered the populace. There are scattered and likely apocryphal reports of entire planets where the inhabitants were born without eyes, or whose retinas no longer responded to light. Whether this was mutation, evolution, or conscious gene tampering remains unclear. But in these stories, the people did not mourn the loss of sight. They celebrated it as divine, and there were deeper horrors. Some sects took darkness to the extreme, believing that even the memory of light was dangerous. They built shrines where initiates underwent procedures to erase photonic memory, psychic surgery to purge the very concept of brightness from the mind. These cults did not merely hide from the warp. They sought to become spiritually undetectable, erasing their luminous imprint on reality. It is said that their prayers were nothing but synchronized heartbeats, and that they measured time not in days, but in silence. This spiritual embrace of darkness created a profound rift between these survivors and other human colonies. Where one world might cherish the last flickering sun lamps of their ancestors, another would view that light as a sacrilege, an act of war against the void. When contact between such civilizations was re-established, it often ended in brutal conflict, not over resources, but over ontological terror. To the drowners, those who clung to light were not misguided. They were summoning death. Even long after warp storms subsided, these cultures remained in shadow. Their myths became fossilized theology, their practices encoded into every structure and social interaction. Light, to them, was more than danger. It was the face of the enemy. When the Imperium eventually arrived, these people were often exterminated as heretics or assimilated at gunpoint, their gods of silence replaced with the burning image of the God Emperor. But remnants of their thought remain, buried in the dark corners of the galaxy, in the unlit shrines beneath hive cities, in the quietest cells of inquisitorial archives. To the drowners, survival was never about technology alone. It was a psychological metamorphosis, a species-wide pivot away from perception and into concealment. They believed in their marrow that safety was not a fortress, but an absence, a world without signal, without song, without light. They drowned themselves not in despair, but in purpose, knowing that to see was to suffer, and to be seen was to cease. There were those who refused to let humanity's light die completely, even in the most harrowing ages of the warp tide. But among the drowners, another kind of brilliance emerged, not of lumens and solar rays, but of intellect pushed to extremes by necessity. They were the architects of artificial night, a casteless breed of savants, half mechanic, half mystic, who understood that concealment was not just a spiritual act. It was an engineering problem. These figures rarely had names. They drifted between shattered worlds and cloistered enclaves, sharing fragments of black tech between hushed conclaves and underworld markets. Some were failed Mechanicum adepts, expelled for doctrines that violated Mars's sacrosanct liturgies. Others were pre-Imperial techno-shamans, descended from rogue AI cults, forbidden gene alchemists, or archivists of lost standard template constructs. Wherever they came from, their genius was unorthodox, their inventions heretical, but they saved entire worlds. The first great innovation was null field diffusion. Using overlapping gravitic distorters, planetary engineers learned to bleed away energy signatures so subtly that even auspexes couldn't detect a city's presence unless they were directly above it. These shadow lattices became foundational. They turned entire arcologies into pockets of absolute stealth, shielded not by walls, but by atmospheric camouflage that cooled thermal emissions to match the surrounding void. Cloaking became more elaborate with each passing century. Photonic siphons were developed, devices that absorbed ambient light and redirected it into null batteries, not only rendering spaces visually blank, but weaponizing collected energy for planetary defense or further concealment. On some high-tech worlds, orbital mirrors were reprogrammed to deflect starlight into deep space, casting entire hemispheres into engineered eclipses that could last decades. Architectural design also changed. Structures were built with refractive geometries, scattering what little light remained into useless vectors. No right angles, no reflective surfaces. Buildings folded inward like petals of a dead flower. Streets curved irregularly, preventing sightlines or movement patterns that demons could predict. At the planetary scale, cities were sunken into the crust or built beneath vast, lightless oceans, buried under ice sheets, or suspended within gas giants' upper atmospheres where no light could penetrate. These cities became masterpieces of silence. Energy use was tightly rationed, routed through quantum decouplers that prevented detectable flux. Artificial intelligence, though blasphemous by Imperial standards, was often required to manage the intricate systems of blackout and detection suppression. Some of these AIs, if they can be called that, communicated only in compression codes based on entropy levels, ensuring that even digital thought could not be tracked across the warp. But even these technologies were not enough when the warp became too aggressive. So the architects turned inward, developing personal blackout tech, armor woven with null fiber thread, cloaks that canceled kinetic sound, helmets with light-absorbent visors that gave the illusion of eyelessness. Elite squads of shadow retainers patrolled their cities, enforcing quietude, maintaining anti-signal zones, and executing those who violated the darkness with flares, heat surges, or prayers spoken too loudly. At their most sophisticated, artificial night became a total system. Life support, governance, even emotional expression was channeled through non-emissive systems. On one world, children were implanted with voice inhibitors at birth. On another, entire generations were raised in zero illumination chambers, educated through haptic feedback pods and dream impression training. The cities themselves pulsed with low-frequency null tones, waves that disrupted warp probing, creating a kind of psychic static that masked soul signatures from demonic attention. The greatest of these inventors, according to fragments and myths, created an artifact known only as the Midnight Lumen, a paradox device that produced a negative light, erasing photons, thoughts, and perhaps even causality within a given radius. No records confirm its existence, but it is said that when activated, even the warp looked away. These inventors were not without their critics. Many believed they were tampering with phenomena far beyond human ken, drawing the ire of the warp by manipulating its very opposite. Some turned to madness, unable to distinguish between concealment and erasure. The line between hiding and unmaking blurred. Entire enclaves disappeared, consumed not by demons, but by their own overzealous blackout tech collapsing into singularities of non-being. Still, the work of these shadowmancers, if such a term can be forgiven, endured. Even millennia later, scattered references in Ordo Xenos archives, forbidden Mechanicus vaults, and rogue trader logs suggest that some of these technologies still function, buried in tomb cities or hidden aboard derelict void ships, perfectly silent in the dark. They are not relics, they are warnings. Proof that survival once required more than faith. It demanded total engineered absence. They moved like ghosts through the dark, their cities silent as tombs and colder than the void outside. The drowners of light who reached this level of discipline and technological mastery became almost mythic in their detachment from what we might recognize as civilization. These were not hives of buzzing humanity or glimmering domes of progress. They were vast, submerged ecosystems of lightless harmony, engineered not for comfort or growth, but for disappearance. Entire populations lived and died without ever seeing the stars, or even each other's faces. On the dead world of Vale Athen, ruins remain of a city built beneath a kilometer of black ice. The ice wasn't natural. It was seeded and expanded over centuries, made from artificially reinforced carbon lattice frost, engineered to absorb heat and reflect nothing. Above it, the surface was a mirror of the stars, perfect and unchanging, giving no hint of what slept beneath. Inside, the city pulsed with geothermal vents rerouted through fiber tunnels, circulating warmth through echo-deadened chambers. Communication happened by pulse code vibrations in the floor. Homes were monastic cells, their interiors shaped by thermal contours rather than architecture. It is said the last child born in Vale Athen never opened her eyes. Another known example is Orbital Deep Shadow 3, an arcology suspended in the Lagrange point of a dead star. The station was encased in magnetically charged dust shrouds that made it appear as background static to Auspex arrays. It emitted no signal, used no visual spectrum lighting, and its population of 6,000 cyborg ascetics were forbidden to speak aloud under penalty of airlock. Food was processed through communal digestion vats, and dreams were regulated by neural damping fields to avoid psychic emissions. There are rumors that its ruins still drift, its last inhabitants perfectly mummified in zero light. The aesthetic of these worlds defies logic. There is beauty there, but it's not the kind we can see. It's in the texture of absolute quiet, the elegance of survival through absence. Entire walls were built to feel, right to the hand, rather than appear a certain way. Corridors were curved to guide blind footsteps, without sharp turns or intersections. Temples were sonic cathedrals that responded to breath and heart rate. Some drowner cities incorporated negative space as a design principle. Entire wings existed only as voids between sensory fields, inhabited not physically but by memory and resonance. Over generations, residents became indistinguishable from their surroundings. Skins turned gray, then black, adapting to absorb warmth in frozen vaults. Voices became extinct, replaced by coded breathing patterns or ultrasonic clicks. Some developed echolocation. Others genetically engineered new forms of communication entirely, pheromonal thought transmissions or bioelectric pulses like those of deep-sea Terran fish. The line between human and environment blurred, and for some, finally dissolved. Culture in these submerged civilizations was not preserved through images or texts. Storytelling became physical, rituals encoded in hand pressure, in the brushing of feet on textured floors. Oral traditions turned into rhythmic pulses tapped into walls. A hero's tale might be passed down as a 5-minute sequence of spine-flex gestures performed during meditation. Their myths were woven into silence, shaped in the patterns of shared sleep and communal stillness. Social structure, too, was alien. There were no monarchs, no visible leaders. Authority flowed along lines of resonance. Elders recognized not by age or achievement, but by the precision of their silence, their ability to still thought and motion in others. Governance was harmonic. Decisions were made by synchronized heartbeats during trance. Collective votes cast not in speech, but in attuned vibrations. Even birth and death were ceremonies of concealment. Children were raised in sensory deprivation chambers, emerging into their societies only after neural maturation allowed them to control their mental radiance. Death was not mourned publicly. It was recorded in thermal fingerprints pressed into a communal obelisk of black stone, one touch per soul, never seen, never spoken of. And yet, these places were not stagnant. They innovated in darkness. They philosophized without language. Their science evolved in the realm of pure function. Their faith was not to a god of light, but to the night that had spared them. 1,000,000 small discoveries flourished beneath the ice and in the empty orbital shadows. Zero-entropy engines, void-dwelling crops, anti-thought fields that masked psyker presences. They did not seek to expand. They sought only to remain. Perhaps the most tragic irony is that many of these civilizations died not because they were found, but because they began to forget why they hid. As generations passed, born in total safety, in perfected shadow, some grew curious. They experimented with light, a bioluminescent art movement, an attempt to generate stars for personal contemplation. A single flare fired into the void in a moment of youthful rebellion. One pulse was enough. The warp always watched. What remains now are husks, lightless tombs in orbit, or cities beneath ruined moonscapes where nothing stirs. Some have been entered by rogue archaeotechs or Inquisition death squads. Few return, and when they do, they bring stories of echoing quiet, of bone chimes whispering in black air, of a pressure in the skull that grows stronger the longer one stays. Some say the drowners aren't dead. They just stepped deeper into the dark, far enough that even the warp can't find them. Among the ruins of silence, stories still drift, tales of saints who bore no names, martyrs who shunned the sun, and relics whose holiness was defined not by their glow, but by their absence. These are the Technosaints of shadow, revered by the Drowners as guardians of the void, visionaries who walked deeper into darkness than any before or since. Their legends are few, barely whispered, often lost to the censures of the ecclesiarchy. But to those who remember, they are the unbroken spine of a forgotten gospel, salvation through concealment. The Technosaints did not seek sainthood. Most were engineers, fugitives, or misfits who stumbled upon revelations in the pitch-black depths of human desperation. Take, for instance, the blind mechanist of Harlov's Reach. According to fragments preserved in a secret Ordo Chronos archive, he was a magos expelled from Mars for heretical tampering with null logic circuits. Cast into the dark tide of warp storms, he crash-landed on a nameless ice world and survived by building a city without energy, without light, powered entirely by geothermal pressure, differentials and logic engines cooled in the planet's crust. His final act was to sever his own optic nerves, believing that perfect design required no sight, only harmony with the dark. The city lasted 3 centuries before being swallowed by a warp bleed. But some say it still functions, cold and quiet, orbiting its dead sun. Another legend speaks of Mother Vale, a matriarch priestess of a drowner sect that lived in an orbital graveyard above a shattered forge world. She is remembered not for miracles of healing, but for the ritual silencing of thought. It was said she could touch a child and erase their dreams, shielding them from demonic sniffing. In her later years, she taught entire generations to think only in rhythm, sinking minds like drumbeats in a choir of nothingness. Her death was recorded not by voice, but by the sudden perfect stillness of the entire habitat. No breath, no step, just void. Then there is the Black Navigator, perhaps the most infamous of these shadow saints. He is never named, and no proof exists of his house or birth. According to fringe navigator cults, he guided an ark ship of refugees through a triple warp storm, using no astronomicon, no charts, and no light. His method was simple. He erased himself. Through gene edits, psycho-conditioning, and null mask implants, he severed all psychic presence, becoming a blind spot even in the Imperium. The demons could not see him, not because he was hidden, but because he had made himself unseeable. His ship emerged after 17 subjective years, with only one survivor, a child marked with his sigil, a spiral of negative space tattooed onto the retina. The relics of these saints are even rarer than their stories, but they do exist. In the forbidden vaults of the Inquisition, there are rumors of the No Lamp of Sarvan Station, a lightless orb that emits anti-photons, believed to be used by early Drowner engineers to test shadow sanctuaries. Those who stare into it for too long reportedly lose their memory of brightness altogether. There is also the Veil Crown, a lattice of black iron said to erase the wearer's soul signature entirely. It was last worn by a cult leader who infiltrated an ecclesiarchal cathedral and died unnoticed in its crypts. To this day, they say the cathedral's choir sings slightly off-key, as if some part of it cannot be heard. Worship of these saints is disorganized, persecuted, and mostly extinct. But it persists in corners where the light of the Emperor does not reach. In the deepest sump levels of hive cities, there are congregations who gather not around candles, but beneath broken lights. They offer prayers in breath alone, exhaling synchronously into the cold. Some paint their eyes black to mimic blindness. Others tattoo null spells across their tongues to ensure silence even in pain. The ecclesiarchy considers these cults not merely heretical, but existentially threatening. The idea that holiness could be found not in the Emperor's radiance, but in engineered darkness, is anathema. Entire purges have been carried out to eliminate traces of these saints. Statues smashed, texts burned, ruins quarantined. And yet, the deeper the Imperium digs, the more shadow relics it uncovers, built into derelict ships, carved into asteroid vaults, encoded into star maps as empty coordinates where only darkness answers the call. The tragedy is profound. These saints did not defy the Emperor. Many may never have heard of him, Their devotion was to survival, to the preservation of humanity in its most fragile form. They believed that to exist was sacred, even if no one saw you. Especially then. In their silence there was purpose. In their erasure, hope. They were not gods. They were not heroes. They were people who stared into the warp and chose not to scream, but to vanish. And in doing so, they carved the first faint steps toward an alternative vision of humanity's destiny. One not bound to light, but to endurance, to humility, to stillness. To those who carry their memory, these saints are not forgotten. They are present in every moment of quiet, every unlit corridor, every breath held in dread. They are the proof that even in the pitch black, there is faith. Not in what we see, but in what we choose to hide from. The warp does not hate light, it simply notices it. This is a distinction often lost in the rigid dualisms of the ecclesiarchy. But among the drowners, and even beyond them, in the minds of alien civilizations who had long studied the ebb and scream of the Imperium, this principle became the foundation of survival. Mankind was not the only species to face the horrors of the warp. It was not even the first. Across the galaxy, in dead languages and erased genomes, there exist echoes of other beings who learned to drown the light, not in fear, but in calculation. The Eldar, most famously, danced on the edge of this knowledge. Before the fall, they had perfected 1,000 ways to hide their minds. Infinity circuits, soul stones, and webway crypts were only part of a vast arsenal of occlusion technologies. But even before their civilization collapsed into She Who Thirsts, there were fringe craft worlds that experimented with null spectra cloaking and psionic suppression fields. Some believed that reducing their psychic profile in the Immaterium was the only way to halt their spiral into decadence. They failed, but the knowledge remains, buried in the minds of outcast seers and locked in circuits guarded by machines older than the Imperium itself. The Hrud, if one can call them a civilization, offer a more extreme example. These entropy-ridden creatures do not simply avoid warp detection. They infest the margins of reality itself. Their presence distorts causality and degrades matter, making them nearly impossible to track or destroy. But among xenologists, there is speculation that the Hrud developed this state as a defense mechanism. Their naturally occurring temporal fugue fields are not just evolutionary quirks. They are artifacts of design, a kind of living anti-noticeability that renders them phantasmal to both mortal sensors and demonic hunger. Then there are the Rakgol, grotesque in their brutality, but rumored to maintain entire fleets that operate in total blackout. No light, no signals, only magneto-gravitic whispers across the void. These dark-clad ships are spoken of by voidfarers as literal ghosts, untraceable until the moment of boarding. It is unclear whether this practice is a conscious nod to warp shielding or merely savage pragmatism, but it works. Even demons seem to skirt around Rakgol-infested sectors, as if their savagery carries a weight too chaotic even for the Immaterium. Inquisitorial reports mention minor xenospecies, long extinct, that developed far more elegant methods. The Quarathi, for instance, were crystalline beings that refracted light and thought alike. Their cities were prism sinks, designed to scatter and nullify psychic emissions across thousands of refractive planes. No clear record exists of their demise. It is theorized they simply faded so completely from warp perception that not even history could recall them. Some of the most haunting parallels come from species that did not rely on technology at all. The Shrouders of the Tevan Expanse were rumored to exist only as psionic impressions, beings who meditated themselves into a state of conceptual invisibility. Their planets were found abandoned, not destroyed. Whole biospheres untouched, but empty, as if every mind had simply chosen not to be. Some inquisitors believe they achieved a state of permanent null thought, a kind of mass transcendental occlusion. Others think they were devoured in a single instant the moment one of them dared to remember themselves. This Xenos knowledge has not been ignored by humanity entirely, at least not by those willing to look beyond the dogma. The Ordo Xenos, particularly its radical factions, has long compiled warp avoidance behaviors across species. Some experiments have attempted to replicate Hrud fugue fields using captured artifacts. Others have dissected Eldar cloaking rituals to understand their psychotemporal rhythm. Even certain rogue navigators have practiced blind jumps inspired by alien methods, relying not on the Astronomicon but on the perceived absence of warp disturbance. Few survive, but those who do often speak in hushed tones of black lanes in the warp, corridors of forgetfulness carved by beings no longer remembered. Despite the Imperium's brutal xenophobia, whispers of Xenos-derived cloaking tech persist. There are void ships that run darker than sanctioned, hive cities that have adopted sound-dampening infrastructure eerily similar to Hrud nesting principles, ecclesiarchy temples constructed with Eldar anti-site geometries, passed off as mere ornamentation. Every so often, a scholar goes missing after publishing too closely aligned a theory. Yet the knowledge spreads, not through official doctrine, but through need. Because while faith offers strength, survival often demands heresy. The warp cannot be fought with swords alone. In the alien, in the forgotten, in the profane, there is hidden knowledge, ways to shield the soul not with sanctity, but with secrecy. The Drowners were not alone. They were part of a greater pattern, a galactic instinct echoing through species after species. Hide, dim, vanish. For in the warp, to exist loudly is to invite agony. And in that terrible silence between stars, it is the quiet civilizations, the unseen, the drowned, the erased, that endure. The rise of the Imperium was a triumph of will over chaos, but it was also a war of memory, a violent purging of every ideology, every custom, and every survival tactic that dared contradict the Emperor's radiant dominion. The Drowners of Light, with their sacred silence and engineered darkness, stood as an affront not just to Imperial power, but to its cosmology. In their continued existence was proof that there were other ways to survive the warp. That could not be allowed. The ecclesiarchy, in particular, saw the worship of shadow as heresy in its purest form. The Emperor was light. His gaze illuminated all. His justice burned like 1,000 suns. Anything that sought to obscure, to conceal, to drown light in shadow was an abomination. As the Imperium expanded, absorbing or annihilating pre-Imperial civilizations, the Drowners were among the first to be targeted for theological extermination. Purges were swift and brutal. Entire planets were carpet-bombed with orbital sun lances designed not to kill, but to blind, overloading the biospheres with artificial radiance until ecosystems collapsed. Cities that had existed in peace for millennia were burned under the banner of spiritual reclamation. Survivors were forced to kneel beneath floodlights, while ecclesiarchal confessors read litanies of illumination. Children raised in generations of sacred silence were taught to scream hymns of the God Emperor until their voices cracked. The archives suffered worst of all. Shadow libraries were not merely destroyed, they were erased. Vaults of null data were rendered into slag by melta charges. Texts encoded in silent code were overwritten with blaring sermons. Some inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus made careers on hunting down even whispered rumors of Technosaints or shadow doctrines. Even Mechanicus enclaves who had once respected the engineering genius of artificial night were forced to recant or be annihilated. The Drowners, already fragmented and secretive, vanished even further into hiding. But erasure is never perfect. The ecclesiarchy's aggression often created as many echoes as it silenced. Inquisitorial logs from the Helios campaign report entire PDF units going mad after prolonged exposure to illuminatory bombardment, whispering in their sleep about the truth behind the veil. One Crusade fleet tasked with purging the Drowner outpost of Olam's Hollow returned reporting no combat, but experiencing 17 hours of absolute auditory absence, during which their astropaths wept blood and refused to speak ever again. And then there are the relics. The Imperium was thorough, but some things could not be unmade. A few blackout artifacts found their way into forbidden collections, hidden in deep Mechanicus vaults or hoarded by rogue traders. These relics, incapable of being fully understood, were often misused. In one tragic case, a cardinal minor of Orpheus Secundus attempted to use a recovered null lamp to exorcise a warp infestation in a cathedral's crypt. Instead, the entire structure vanished, its stone and congregation alike, leaving behind only an absence in the shape of a church. The ecclesiarchy also faced resistance, not from the drowners, who had no army, but from within its own lower echelons. Acolytes who had served in the void, who had seen demons ignore the shadowed decks of rogue ships while slaughtering the lit ones, began to question. Priests who tended the lightless shrines in the underhives sometimes found their faith strengthened by shadow, not diminished. Some of these clerics began small, secret orders dedicated to the Emperor's quiet radiance, an unorthodox belief that his light could be found even in silence, even in unseen acts of devotion. Most were hunted. A few persisted. By the time of the modern Imperium, the memory of the drowners has been reduced to myth, misrepresented in ecclesiarchal sermons as cautionary tales. They are described as cowards, heretics who hid from the Emperor's light and were punished accordingly. But the truth remains encoded in fragments, a ruined city beneath a glacial plate where no sensors work, a tithing report listing a system that produces no light, no signal, but whose population has not changed in 10,000 years. A pilgrim's diary, banned by decree, describing a monastery where the Emperor's name is never spoken aloud, only breathed. This is the cost of the Imperium's obsession with illumination. In its crusade to drown the dark in fire, it destroyed knowledge that might have helped it endure. Now, as warp storms grow stronger and entire sectors vanish beneath psychic tides, the memory of the drowners becomes more than tragedy. It becomes warning. For in their silence was wisdom. In their hidden cities was proof that survival need not come through conquest, but through humility, through absence, through the quiet genius of those who understood that not every flame is a beacon. Somewhere in the galaxy, behind veils thicker than ignorance, their descendants may still walk. They are not seen, they are not known, but they endure, unburned by faith, untouched by the warp, forgotten by history, and unbroken. Drowners still exist, and they remember what the Imperium forced itself to forget, that light is not always salvation. Sometimes it is a scream. The galaxy has grown louder. Every flicker of warp drive, every psychic pulse, every illuminated cathedral pressing against the skin of unreality, it all adds to the noise, the unbearable scream of a species that no longer knows how to be quiet. And the warp listens. Always it listens. And now it answers more swiftly, more violently than ever before. The Imperium, in its blind devotion to illumination, has created a beacon not of hope, but of agony. For 10,000 years it has burned brighter and louder, and the consequences are now impossible to ignore. There are places in the Imperium where light has become a toxin, worlds near the Eye of Terror, where the mere act of igniting a lumen stick can trigger a psychic bleed. Ships that dare approach the Great Rift and find their pick screens dripping with colors not part of the spectrum. Hive cities in Segmentum Obscurus, where the dawn cycle causes mass hysteria because demons ride the rising sun like parasites. The warp, once unpredictable in its rhythms, now responds with terrifying precision to radiance. Not just physical light, but thought, emotion, prayer, all of it amplified through the cultural mechanisms of the Imperium until it becomes irresistible. One inquisitorial report speaks of an agri-world near the Maelstrom, where seasonal festivals involving light displays led to the summoning of something vast, something that did not scream or lash out, but simply stood, watching, for hours. No one could recall its shape. Only that the light had changed around it, and nothing grew in its shadow afterward. Another tale tells of a Mechanicus experiment in ultraspectrum lumens designed to purify tainted matter. When activated, every servo skull within a 5-kilometer radius became sentient, chanting unknown litanies before melting into slag. Even the Astronomicon, that greatest of psychic flares, has shown signs of strain. Astropaths have begun to report echoes, false navigational beacons that mimic the Emperor's light but lead ships into null space or into the path of raiding fleets. Some believe this is the work of chaos. Others whisper darker theories, that the light itself has become corrupted, no longer a guiding star, but a siren song. An addiction, an overexposure, like a body fed only flame. These are not isolated incidents. Across the Imperium, the cost of relentless exposure grows heavier. Psychers burn out faster. Nulls grow more unstable. Some planetary populations, when exposed to excessive warp energy, do not mutate. They vanish. Not physically, but psychically, their soul signatures erased so completely they can no longer be sensed. The warp, it seems, has grown hungrier for identity, and light is its easiest prey. Ironically, the Imperium's reaction has been to shine even brighter. More holy fire, more declarations of blasphemy against the dark. Worlds have been stripped of night cycles. The Adeptus Ministorum mandates that every street be illuminated with Emperor-blessed luminators, every home fitted with shrine glow units. Children are taught that darkness is the breeding ground of sin, that to close your eyes is to abandon his gaze. But beneath this zealous glow, things fester. On ship hulks drifting near the halo stars, servitors built for maintenance now refuse to enter lit corridors. On high-lumen shrine worlds, statues weep not tears but ash. The people do not speak of it, but they know. They feel it in their bones, in their sleep. The light has begun to watch back. There are places, fewer but still existing, where resistance grows. Not open rebellion, but a return to silence. Isolated outposts have begun to reintroduce darkness, unofficially. Hive sectors marked as under power conservation are allowed to remain dim. Crews aboard long-haul void ships have begun sleeping in total black again, refusing soul lights in their chambers. Not because they believe in the drowners. Most have never heard of them. But because instinct screams that the old ways, the ways of shadow, kept something at bay. And in the depths of the galaxy, hidden behind warp folds and impossible geometry, there are whispers that drowner enclaves have noticed. They are watching. They remember. And they know that the time may come when the light-sick Imperium collapses under the weight of its own brilliance, begging for shade it has long since outlawed. For now, the light screams. It blazes from every cathedral, from every throne, from every soul desperate to be seen by a god who no longer answers. But the warp has always answered, and it has no love for flame, only appetite. In the end, light was never purity. It was noise, and the Imperium has made itself deaf with it. There is a place in the void where signals die, where beacons fail, where the machine spirits of long-dead augurs fall silent, not from damage, but from something deeper, a null, a refusal, a presence so absent it erases others by proximity alone. These are not the empty places of navigational charts. These are the sanctuaries of the unseen, the homes of those who survived, not by defiance, but by vanishing. Across scattered records, quarantined archives, and redacted ordo files, a pattern emerges. The drowners may never have died. Some of them, at least, endured. They changed shape, moved deeper into the dark, and left behind nothing but the quiet. But even the quiet leaks. Fragments surface. Rumors crack through the seal of sanctioned knowledge. Whispers of artificial night cults. Rogue transmissions carried on subharmonic wavelengths. Reports of ships saved from warp incursions by the sudden, unexplained collapse of their energy profiles. In the Ghoul Stars, a rogue trader by the name of Salvatrix Grin claims to have encountered a void colony that responded to no hail, emitted no heat signature, and remained motionless in orbit of a dead gas giant. Her crew approached cautiously, and upon boarding they found a biosphere of thriving humans, healthy, alert, but mute. Every person they met refused to speak. The colony operated on tactile code alone. Their central control systems were engraved with symbols that matched no known human language. When Grin's astropath attempted contact, he suffered a seizure and woke claiming he had seen a mouth made of nothing. The crew left, shaken, and when they tried to return later, the colony was gone. In the archives of the Ordo Xenos, there exists a report designated Phantom Null 7. It details the encounter of an inquisitorial warship with what was believed to be an uncharted Eldar craft world. Upon approach, the ship's cogitators failed. The Geller field faltered, then stabilized. Inside the craft, no life forms were detected. And yet, the internal temperature remained stable. Power flow was steady. Vegetation thrived in hydroponic bays. In the temple chamber, the Inquisitor found a humanoid statue, faceless, featureless, but adorned in robes of light-absorbent fiber. Around it, 13 circles etched into the floor, each ringed with black iron dust. The crew reported headaches, memory gaps, and a loss of emotional variance. The ship was marked for obliteration. The report was buried, but it still exists. Even within the Imperium, there are hints that the Drowner philosophy is not entirely extinct. A black site beneath the hive world of Gathus Tertius houses a penal laboratorium where the most dangerous psychers are taken, not to be executed, but to be muted. There, they are placed in chambers of total darkness, stripped of identity, and exposed to rhythmic null fields until their warp presence is neutralized. It is said that some do not survive, but those who do emerge, changed, silent, stable, untraceable. Some whisper that these individuals are later deployed, not killed, sent into the void on ships without names. There are rumors, too, among navigators. Tales of black pilots, vessels that pass through warp storms unnoticed, whose trajectories make no sense, whose presence cannot be tracked. Some say they follow forgotten trade routes, paths once used by the Drowners before the rise of the Imperium. Others claim these ships move with purpose, ferrying supplies to worlds thought dead, reactivating ancient networks of artificial night. Once, a rogue navigator claimed to have seen one of these vessels in real space. No lights, no windows, only a single emblem etched into its hull, a closed eye inside a spiral. The navigator disappeared weeks later. Official cause: warp madness. In the shadows of Segmentum Pacificus, a minor cardinal was removed from office for spreading an unsanctioned gospel. His sermons preached not of the Emperor's burning light, but of his mercy in obscurity. "The Emperor sees us always," he wrote, "but not through eyes, through silence, through our refusal to call attention to ourselves. He listens in the dark." His church was razed, his writings were destroyed, but a single page survived, passed hand to hand through the underhives. It bears a simple message. Do not light the flame. He is already with you. These are not isolated oddities. They are signs, ripples, proof that the Drowners of Light were never merely a historical footnote. They were the beginning of something, a divergent lineage of human survival that rejected the Imperium's hubris. They saw the warp for what it was, a predator that feasts not on faith or fear, but on exposure, and they chose to starve it. Somewhere out there in the dark between stars, they are watching. They do not signal, they do not beckon, they do not recruit, they endure. And maybe one day when the light finally fails, and the screaming void consumes the last of the golden thrones and neon cathedrals, it will be the Drowners who open their gates once more, not to rule, not to save, but to remind humanity how to disappear. The future is written not in stars, but in shadows. The Imperium stands ablaze, a colossus of faith and flame trying desperately to outshine its own doom. The great rift yawns wider. The Astronomicon flickers. Demons stalk the void with growing boldness, not because they have grown stronger, but because humanity has grown louder. And in the chaos, amidst the crashing ruin of overexposure, the question rises like a chill beneath the skin. What if the way forward is not to burn brighter, but to fade? This is the final lesson the Drowners of Light offer us. That survival was never about conquest or domination or the raw assertion of presence. It was about knowing when to stop being seen, when to stop calling out into the night and start listening to it instead. It was about building a world where quiet is power, where safety lies in subtlety, and where faith is not shouted, but kept like an ember in the chest, warm, unseen, enduring. The Imperium would scoff at this. It teaches that to serve the Emperor is to be visible, always, marching in the light, bleeding in the light, dying in the light. But what if that light is a lure? What if it was never meant to be worshipped so much as wielded, sparingly, carefully when needed, then hidden away before it draws the storm? There is no heresy in seeking survival. Not truly. Not when the alternative is extinction. And the warp does not care about dogma. It cares about presence. It feeds on echoes, identity, soul signatures painted across the stars. The louder we cry for salvation, the more surely it comes for us, not to answer but to feast. So what future might there be in darkness? Picture it. A humanity reborn in silence, void ships with hulls that drink light, cities hidden beneath oceans of carbon dust, faith kept in breath, not banners, empires that do not announce themselves but endure like roots beneath stone, navigators who blind themselves by choice. Saints remembered not in statues, but in the way their absence still holds back the cold. This would not be a humanity of conquerors or crusaders. It would be a species of ghosts, resilient, patient, impossible to kill because it cannot be found. A people who have learned, through unthinkable loss, that true survival is not defiance, but invisibility. The time of the Drowners may come again, not in open return, but in necessity. As the Imperium fractures, as the warp grows hungrier, as light becomes a scream too loud for the void to ignore, more and more worlds may find themselves turning to the only sanctuary that has ever worked. They will dim their lights, silence their thoughts. Listen. And in that silence, they may hear something waiting. Not a god, not a demon, but a memory. The shadow of those who came before. A whisper in the shape of a warning. And maybe, just maybe, the Imperium, what remains of it, will learn to listen too. Not out of wisdom, but out of desperation. Because when the final flare burns out, when the last cathedral collapses under the weight of its own radiance, it will not be the loud who are left. It will be the quiet, the ones who knew how to hide, how to wait, the ones who drowned the light to survive. If this tale has moved you, if the thought of survival through silence, of saints made in shadow, of futures written in whisper rather than war has stirred something within, then join us. Subscribe, because there are more stories buried in the dark, and together we can uncover them quietly. Thank you for guiding this journey through the Drowners of Light. If you have a new title you'd like to explore, or want to build on this one in a new direction, just say the word. I'm ready for the next dive into the grimdark.